Hey everybody, Professor Dust here. Today we're going to talk about authentic leadership. So I would call this another contemporary leadership style or leadership theory. It is another behavioral approach. And before we dive into describing what it is and talking about its dimensions and the whole conceptual model of authentic leadership, I want to talk first about where it came from. In order to talk about where it came from, I'd like to take you through a quick exercise to really help this come to light. So we're going to play a little game. First, I want you to pretend as if you have $10. Okay, I just gave you $10. I also want you to pretend as if you're working with one other person. Doesn't matter who it is, it's just some made-up person or a friend. Now, you need to present a proposal to this partner about how that $10 is going to be divided between the two of you. Okay, and remember, this is a one-time event. You're not going to play this game repeatedly. You're not going to like turn the tables on each other, right? It's just a one-time event, $10, you got to split it up. Here's the catch. The other person can either accept the proposal as it stands and split the money as it was proposed, so whatever you said is how it's going to be split, or they can reject it. And in that case, if they reject it, both of you get nothing, okay? So think just for a moment about how much money will you propose to give to that other person. Okay, maybe you want to give them less than you, maybe you want to give them the same amount, maybe you want to give them more than you, and what exactly would those numbers be? Got your number? Okay. So why did you choose the number that you chose? Many people just say, well, I didn't expect to get this $10. It's a nice freebie. You're my partner. Let's just split it down the middle so that everybody's happy. Some people might take the approach of saying, well, I'm the one who has the authority. I have the $10. It's really up to me. And the other party should be happy with any bit of money that I give them. So I'm going to keep a little bit more for myself and give them some. Maybe I'll keep 6 and I'll give them 4. I'll keep 7 and I'll give them 3. They should be happy with that. Or you might even say, I'm going to keep 9 and give them 1. And they should be happy with that because, hey, they weren't going to get anything. So they should be at least happy with 1. Okay, maybe some people will even say, I don't really need the money. I'm going to do something good. It's going to make me feel good to do something better. Therefore, I'm going to give the other party more than I'm going to give myself. Okay. In the vast majority of cases, people usually choose 5 or to give 4 and keep 6. Right? Why is it that we would do this? Well, number one, we know that the other party gets to react in a certain way. Okay? Because they can decide whether they're going to reject it or accept it, you don't want to upset the other party. Right? It's quite possible that they might be offended if you keep more and give them less, and then be spiteful and say, well, nobody's going to get anything. This is an interesting microcosm of the relationship that you might see between a leader and a follower. Leaders, to some degree, are in a position of authority where the follower has to do, to some degree, do as the leader asked because they do have so much power over that individual, given performance management systems, given the hierarchy and their ability to put in writing that they are doing or not doing what I need them to do. Okay, so for a long time, this ultimatum game, in a way, was pretty skewed. And eventually, people got fed up with the fact that leaders, to some degree, are taking advantage of their authority, taking advantage of their position. They're keeping more of that $10 for themselves. So there was this trend where, for psychosocial reasons, fairness became something that was more prominent, more salient. Right? You can look at the financial crisis with the Occupy Wall Street movement as a great example. That 99% is getting screwed over by the 1%. Right? We feel as if we don't have enough power. We don't have enough say. I'm just a cog in the machine. I'm a robot, and they don't really care about me. They can just replace me with somebody else. And so after a while, there was a little bit of pushback where it became more norm or normal to say, this isn't fair, and I'm not okay with this. Right? So we all have this fundamental sense of fairness, right? It's one of the first things that you can start to recognize in babies, that they have this innate sense of fairness and what's just. And that started to come to light a little bit more, to the point where There was literally social upheavals where people were saying, I'm not going to take it anymore. This isn't okay, right? We have power in numbers, and we demand a leader that actually cares about us and is going to keep it real, is not going to pretend as if they want one thing, but in fact they want another. Okay, so this is kind of where this came from in terms of the psychosocial rationale, but it also is starting to gain interest from a theoretical and academic perspective. A while ago, they'd identified transformational leadership. Within transformational leadership, this idea of authentic transformational leadership, it actually was the opposite of pseudo-transformational leadership. So this idea of being an authentic transformational leader was proposed when they were talking about pseudo-transformational leadership, but it actually never was studied in a lot of detail, and it was just more theoretical and conceptual. And so this kind of came back around the time where transformational leadership was still having its heyday for people to say, hey, there's something to that. If we think pseudo-transformational leadership is real, maybe we should also be looking at authentic leadership as well, right? So there was a real need for this evidence-based approach. So there are several authentic leadership approaches, and the one that we're going to focus on is the developmental approach, but I think it's important to understand all three approaches. So first you have what's called the intrapersonal approach. So intra is within. The next one, interpersonal. Inter is between. It's the way to differentiate intra versus inter. So intrapersonal, it's about what's going on within your own mind, right? So authenticity through self-knowledge and also having this sense of self-regulation, right? So I understand who I am, and I also need to regulate in order to ensure that I stay true to who I am. So that's one perspective or approach you could take to authentic leadership. The challenge, though, is that that's all kind of going on up here, and it's really hard for others to understand what's going on within the brain of the focal authentic leader. It also has a tendency to be biased, because if you're the one rating your own authenticity, perhaps you're not actually being true to yourself and you're wishing that you were a certain way. There's also interpersonal authenticity. And this has to do with this reciprocal relationship between the two. So during that dialogue, during that exchange, I'm being honest and open and authentic about how things are going and where we stand, almost from like a leader-member exchange type perspective. Okay. The third one is developmental. And this is a set of behaviors, individual leader behaviors, similar to what we've talked about so far with servant leadership, transformational leadership, abusive supervision. Okay, so let's walk through what these four dimensions are. First is the dimension of self-awareness. And so self-awareness is about reflecting on whatever makes you you. Your values, who you identify or how you identify, your emotions, your motives, your behavioral tendencies, so like your traits, all of those things. It also is being aware of and trusting your own feelings. So being in tune with how you're feeling and how you might need to adjust to the environment given the circumstances, well enough to know something's not right, or maybe this is a little off, or just making sure that you're headed in the right direction, right? We all kind of have that innate sense of something seems off, so I need to change my behaviors. Second is the internalized moral perspective. So it's having some internal moral standards that are guiding your behavior on what's appropriate. And then from there, the ability to self-regulate to ensure that you don't go on a amoral or immoral behavior and fail to kind of take it back and remind yourself, oh no, that's a gray area. I don't want to go there. And we'll come back to this one in a second. Of the four dimensions, this is the one that is the least like the others. And so maybe some construct validity challenges there. Is it really necessary to have a moral perspective when engaging in this sense of authentic leadership? There's some decent arguments to say it might not be as necessary as the others. The third one is balanced processing. So this is your ability to analyze information objectively. Unfortunately, anytime we take in information, our brain is kind of like a filter, where sometimes we just filter out the things we don't want to hear, but only keep in the things that we do want to hear. Balanced processing has this ability to make sure that we legitimately get everything the same level of legitimacy and give it an honest look. As well, this ability to explore other people's opinions and really genuinely consider them, not in a way that's just for show, but a way that's generally trying to say, yeah, I want to know because I really do want to make the best decision possible, and I can't do that unless I understand what your perspective is. Third is the sense of relational transparency, and this is somewhat similar to that interpersonal perspective of authenticity, where this is being open and honest and presenting one's true self to others. But it's less about that dyadic exchange, and it really is more internal behaviors, or it's the individual behaviors of that person and how they're behaving and how they're acting and how they're presenting themselves. Are they really being their true self? Are they really being honest and open about how they feel and what they're thinking? So let's put authentic leadership now in that conceptual model. Okay, so now let's talk about authentic leadership and what might be its precursor. So authentic leadership is the dependent variable. Now we're going to talk about the independent variables. What types of things lead to people engaging in more authentic leadership behaviors? Well, there's been some research to illustrate that certain individual characteristics, they call them positive psychological characteristics or capacities, and the construct has been called psychological capital. So those that are high in confidence, hope, optimism, resilience, if they're higher on those 4 factors individually, or all 4 of them as what's called a gestalt construct, they have a higher likelihood of engaging in authentic leadership behaviors. There's a few others that are individual characteristics, but that's a popular one. The second one is moral reasoning capacities. So if you do assume that that moral processing perspective is a key part of the authentic leadership construct, then this one is another important one where you have a higher degree of what's called moral reasoning. You're able to decide what's right and wrong, and you really are for a sense of justice, and you kind of view things from an ethical perspective, and you're able to think about the merits of a decision based upon ethical contingencies, not just bottom line contingencies. The third one is interesting in that it's not necessarily about something that's internal to you. It's about experiences that you may have gone through. So anybody that has had some type of critical life event, or perhaps maybe not this major mind-blowing life event, but someone that has thought deeply about what are the critical life events, no matter how minor or major they are, they're more likely to engage in self-reflection processes, which then facilitates this ability to have higher degrees of self-awareness. Okay, so those are some of the antecedents if you were to assume authentic leadership is the dependent variable. Some outcomes of authentic leadership, right? So now in this case, authentic leadership is the independent variable, and these are the outcome variables, or the dependent variables. There's a few that's been studied in the literature. So follower commitment and engagement increases in relation to the degree to which the leader is authentic. Follower self-realization and self-development, right? So they become more in the know on who they are, as well. They're more likely to develop themselves and try to work towards becoming a better person or a better employee. Followers or employees that are following the leader are more likely to have higher degrees of self-efficacy, self-esteem, as well as voice behaviors. They're speaking up, and they're not afraid to kind of speak up and say something that might not necessarily be the popular opinion, and maybe bringing up things to people's attention that really need to be taken notice of, but it's kind of a challenging conversation. It also, authentic leadership has the capacity to increase what's called team reflexivity. And this is important because now this dependent variable is at the team level, not necessarily the individual employee, right? So when an authentic leader is in charge of a team at large, the team at large is more likely to engage in kind of like this reflective, debrief, cohesive conversation that says, how are things going? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What should we do different? Which can certainly be helpful if you're trying to work towards improvement as a team. There's also some leader-specific outcomes, right? So the more I engage in authentic leadership, for example, the more likely I am going to feel as if I have high degrees of psychological well-being, happiness, less depression, feeling fulfilled, etc., as well as leaders' self-perceptions of effectiveness, right? So the more I engage in authentic leadership, you could look down the road and say, hey, how effective do you think you are? And I'm more likely to rate myself as being an effective leader, which is interesting because, as we'll talk about later in some of the criticisms in the next coming slide, is that doesn't necessarily mean that it's objective effectiveness, or that our managers or our employees or the organization at large actually thinks we're effective. But it does certainly mean that I think I'm effective, perhaps because I'm fulfilling the things that I think are important to me, and I'm behaving in a way and leading in a way that I think is real, right? And so that can make me feel as if, well, I must be doing it the right way as long as I'm doing it in a way that's real. So here's the strengths and weakness slide. So there are some strengths to authentic leadership. Number one, it fulfills this need for trust in leadership and in our leaders. And that was certainly filling a gap when it first came about, to say, are they really shooting it to us straight? Are they keeping it real? Are they having open, honest conversations? Or are they just saying what they're supposed to say because they're a leader and they feel as if they have to say those things? Or are they really just kind of pulling one over on us and they don't really believe it, right? We really needed that at that certain point in time, and that then helped authentic leadership become a popular construct. It also has really specific guidelines for development, which I appreciate when theoretical constructs are proposed and items are created and it's evaluated in the literature, and we look at it against all these different variables that are out there. That's helpful, but it also is important to make it really clear for the practitioners, what exactly does this mean and how can I actually develop it? If we really believe that it's doing good things, okay, then what is the strategy? What is the approach that can ensure that we increase the amount or the degree to which somebody is engaging in these authentic leadership behaviors? This is partially why it was important that we are looking at the developmental approach to authentic leadership. Arguably, it's much harder to develop those other two approaches, intrapersonal and interpersonal. So in terms of weaknesses, number one, as I mentioned earlier, that moral component, that moral processing dimension, it's relatively unclear in terms of its theoretical connection to the construct of authentic leadership as a whole. As well, arguably, if you look at the four dimensions altogether, it's the one that doesn't seem to hang as well. And I think some of the research is starting to illustrate that when they do report at the dimension level what the correlations between those are. Not to say it's not important, not to say that it can't be part of the construct, but if anything, it is the least clear in terms of its connection to authentic leadership. The next is mediating mechanisms. So we talked about antecedents of authentic leadership, and we talked about or precursors, independent variables. We also talked about outcomes of authentic leadership, the dependent variables. The real question is still, okay, why is authentic leadership leading to these dependent variables, these employee outcomes or team outcomes or leader outcomes? The mediating mechanism that explains that relationship is still relatively unclear, hasn't been fleshed out incredibly well. Yes, there's studies that have been done, but they haven't really come up with something that seems to be super that's repeated over and over in a variety of different samples and a variety of different studies with a variety of different settings. That is still yet to be borne out. And then finally, there's some tensions in authentic leadership in that it's not always possible to actually be an authentic leader. Number one, you might not really have all that much power to engage in what you want to do or what you believe to be what's most appropriate, right? Perhaps there's superiors above you that are saying you must do a certain thing. Maybe the structure of the organization is so mechanistic that it's hard to really be your true self. So that those other dynamics, they kind of play into the degree to which someone can actually engage in authentic leadership. Number two, this is similar, but getting at the organizational purpose. So maybe there's a strategy, maybe there's a mission in place that really just doesn't align incredibly well with what that person is trying to accomplish. And maybe that's the circumstance where the authentic leader might say, well, then I'm not meant to be here. And then finally, time. It takes time to be an authentic leader and engage in the behaviors that we discussed here, right? So engaging in relational processing, balance processing, relational transparency and balance processing as an example, that takes time, right? You have to communicate those things. You have to work through the nitty-gritty nuances of those conversations to illustrate that you're engaging in that type of thought process. So time is a resource, and it's a limited resource in organizations. And so it might not always be possible to really represent your full self or your true self in terms of authentic leadership. Okay, so that rounds out authentic leadership. One of the contemporary approaches to leadership. We talked about where it came from, talked about its dimensions, talked about its conceptual model, so its antecedents and its consequences, as well as its strengths and weaknesses as a construct.